My name is Michael Taylor. I'm the new director of the Hood Museum of Art. I think I can only say that for about another 2 weeks, but I'm going to still say new for a while. It's great to be here. Please turn off your cell phones. I myself need to remind when I get back to my seat to do that. And welcome to the first inaugural Manton Foundation lecture. We would like to express our deep thanks to the Manton Foundation, which has generously funded an endowment that supports scholarship of the Orozco mural, as well as its care and conservation. The foundation has also, through a separate grant, made possible a new lighting scheme for the mural that is currently in development. And this is very exciting. I think that the murals will be lit in a way that they never have been before, and you'll see them with fresh eyes. I cannot think of anyone more appropriate to deliver this inaugural lecture than Mary Coffey, Associate Professor of Art History at Dartmouth College, and to my mind, the leading scholar on the work of Jose Clemente Orozco. Professor Coffey received her PhD in art history from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. In addition to teaching courses on American art and culture, Mexican and Latin American art, and Mexican muralism, Professor Coffey has also taught specialized courses on public art, fluxus, and museum practice, as well as the introductory survey of Western art history. Before joining the faculty at Dartmouth, she taught at Pomona College from 1999 to 2001, and was a faculty fellow and internship coordinator at New York University's graduate program in museum studies from 2001 to 2004. Professor Coffey has published many articles and catalog essays, including Angels and Prostitutes, Jose Clemente Orozco's Catharsis and the Politics of Female Allegory in 1930s Mexico. That was in the New Centennial Review, I should say. And I'm Not the Fourth Great One, Rufino Tamayo and Mexican Muralism in Tamayo, a Modern Icon Reinterpreted, for the Santa Barbara Museum of Art. She has recently completed her book, How a Revolutionary Art Became Official Culture, Murals, Museums, and the Mexican State, which will be published next year by Duke University Press. This much-anticipated book offers the first study of the reciprocal relationship between Mexican muralism and Mexican museum practice. Through case studies of the nation's 3 most significant public museums, all of which include major works of mural art, namely the Palace of Fine Arts, the National History Museum, and the National Anthropology Museum, Professor Coffey's book traces the transformation of Mexican muralism from a public art with radical social intentions into a form of state propaganda. She is currently conducting new research for a second book on the exhibition of folk art within Mexico and the United States that explores the role that folk art has played in cultivating national and transnational identities, as well as the development of the tourist economy. She's also the co-author of the Hood Museum of Art's brochure on Dartmouth's Orozco mural and has delivered a podcast on it for visitors. Her lecture today is titled Cortes and the Angel of History, Reflections on Orozco's Epic of American Civilization and Messianic Time. Please join me in welcoming Professor Mary Coffey.
Well, thank you for being here tonight. Can you hear me? I think this is the first time I've addressed Dartmouth, and it's wonderful to be doing it on this occasion. I want to share Michael's enthusiasm for the Manton Foundation and the care and the resources that they're putting toward scholarship on this important mural cycle and the conservation and preservation of it here at Dartmouth College. And I want to say one other thing before I begin. I wanted to acknowledge 2 of my colleagues, George Edmondson and Klaus Mlodek. I'm not sure if Klaus is here. But I acknowledge them because they invited me to participate in a Humanities Institute at the Leslie Center for the Humanities 2 years ago on the states of exception, a body of theory, a political theory that I was not very familiar with at the time, and it's sort of come to fruition now. It's taken me a couple of years to really work out the impact that some of what we read in that institute has had on my thinking about this mural. And in particular, it was my introduction to Walter Benjamin's theses on the philosophy of history. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. And it is preliminary. It's new work for me. So it's exciting and a bit unnerving to be presenting something in such a draft form. But I'm really eager to get responses to the work as I move toward revision. So with that, I'll begin. And I need to ask that the lights be lowered a bit. Thanks. In Thesis 9 of his Theses on the Philosophy of History, the German Jewish theorist Walter Benjamin writes, quote, "A clay painting named Angelus Novus shows an angel looking as though he is about to move away from something he is fixedly contemplating. His eyes are staring, his mouth is open, his wings are spread. This is how one pictures the angel of history. His face is turned toward the past. Where we perceive a chain of events, he sees one single catastrophe which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed, but a storm is blowing from paradise. It has got caught in his wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close them. This storm irresistibly propels him into the future to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. This storm is what we call progress," end quote. This infamous description of Clay's work encapsulates Benjamin's critical understanding of history as well as the method of his material historiography. Benjamin treats Clay's image as a dialectical one in which time has been arrested and history is revealed to be a single catastrophe rather than a chain of events. The angel faces the past with his back turned away from the future. His recognition of the true nature of history, while terrifying, holds the possibility of redemption. He wants to awaken the dead and make whole what has been smashed, but the violent wind of progress prevents him from doing so. Benjamin's idiosyncratic reading of Clay's image provides an oblique critique of historicism. Likewise, as metaphor, it performs the task of the material historian, which Benjamin describes as, quote, retaining that image of the past which unexpectedly appears to man singled out by history at a moment of danger, end quote. This man singled out by history is endowed with what Benjamin calls a weak messianic power, to liberate the fullness of the past from the historicist's reduction. If historicists treat the past as a universal and eternalized sequence of events unfolding in empty time, according to a teleology of progress, the materialist historian understands the so-called facts of the past are a construction of the present, whereas historicists empathize with the victorious when laying out the course of history. The material historian views the past from the standpoint of the oppressed. Historicists maintain that our present is the logical and necessary outcome of a process set in motion in the past, and that any aberration from this logic of progress is but an anomalous state of emergency. The materialist sees that the state of emergency is not the exception but the rule, and that redemption can come only if we recognize, quote, the constellation our own era has formed with an episode or event from the past, end quote. Benjamin's understanding of history as a creative and constructive act counters the causal logic of historicism with a conception of history that crystallizes in what he calls messianic time. Messianic time refers us not to the past, nor to a utopian future, but rather to the now of the present, a moment of danger that holds the potential for us to recognize the claim the past has made on us. In my remarks today, I read Orozco's Epic of American Civilization as a dialectical image in the Benjaminian sense. Like the angel of history, Orozco refuses to reassure us with a utopian vision of the future and instead faces the American past. In his mural, American history is presented from the standpoint of the continent's indigenous peoples as a catastrophe. Progress, represented by Cortes, is indeed a storm blowing from paradise. For in Orozco's telling, the military and spiritual conquest of the Americas represents a destructive rather than constructive origin for the modern nation state. What critical power does Orozco's unexpected image of the American past demand of us? His emphasis on catastrophe, wreckage, and debris, I argue, speaks to a revolutionary hope for social justice, for redemption. But his materialist history, like that of Benjamin, is anti-historicist. It therefore carries an implicit critique of not only the authoritarian cultural practices of the modern nation state, but also the alternatives articulated by artists and intellectuals on the left. Thus, his vision of redemption has to be approached as something other than the vulgar Marxist utopianism of his peer Diego Rivera. And likewise, despite the culminating scene of Christian apocalypse, I insist that Orozco's epic does not partake of Christian eschatology. Rather, the messianism that structures Orozco's mural conjures the weak messianic power that Benjamin ascribes to us. Tonight, I interrogate Orozco's engagement with messianism, both pagan and Christian, and the way that messianic prophecy structures the spatial organization and thematic content of his cycle. In particular, I focus on three messianic figures: Quetzalcoatl, Cortes, and Christ, and the relation between them to better ascertain the constellation Orozco is forming between the pre-conquest past and the moment of danger in which he painted. I maintain that the ongoing power of Orozco's mural lies in its demand that we recognize its concerns as our own. My remarks today represent my initial attempt to bring Orozco's mural into a dialogue with Benjamin's theses on the philosophy of history, and in particular his concept of messianic time. However, I want to be clear that I am not describing a causal relationship whereby Orozco is intentionally illustrating Benjamin's theory. Rather, I see them as generating analogous insights about the ethics of history due to each man's vexed relationship with historicist national cultural projects and the political regimes benefiting from them. In Benjamin's case, I am referring, of course, to the National Socialist exploitation of antiquity when constructing the mythology of the Third Reich. And for Orozco, it was Mexico's post-revolutionary state and the official indigenismo promoted by artists and intellectuals to construct an autonomous national identity rooted in imperial Aztec civilization. The epic of American civilization consists of roughly 24 scenes dispersed across the walls of the Orozco Room in Dartmouth's Baker-Berry Library. Orozco executed the mural in true fresco between June of 1932 and February of 1934 while employed as a visiting professor in the art department. Despite the literary references in his title, Orozco's epic is not a story. Rather, it is comprised of discrete images juxtaposed with one another in a provocative but non-didactic manner. Writing in 1934 as he completed the cycle, Orozco emphatically declared, quote, "In every painting, as in any other work of art, there is always an idea, never a story. The idea is the point of departure, the first cause of the plastic construction, and it is present all the time as energy-creating matter. The stories and other literary associations exist only in the mind of the spectator, the painting acting as the stimulus." Commenting on this statement, Renato González Mayo has noted that the Spanish word for story, historia, is also the word for history. Mayo likens what he characterizes as Orozco's asymmetrical handling of form and narration, idea and history, to the dialectical materialism of Soviet filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein's montage theory. This dialectical, as opposed to linear approach to image making, demands an active viewer who must work to synthesize the meaning of often abrupt juxtapositions within the sequence of panels, rather than passively read a seemingly cohesive visual narrative. Moreover, the dialectical approach agitates against the progressive or evolutionary structure of most historical mural cycles. Orozco, as we will see, posits a discontinuous and eruptive model of history that is asymmetrical and radically questions the relationship between past, present, and future. This is an overview of the cycle. I'm assuming most people have seen it, but just to be clear, it's been sort of stretched out into long single images, but these are the migration, ancient human sacrifice, the scene of Quetzalcoatl's arrival, the Golden Age and departure, Aztec warriors, the prophecy, Cortes and the cross, the machine, Anglo and Hispano-America, modern gods, or the birth of dead knowledge, and then modern human sacrifice and the modern migration of the spirit. I'm going to be referring to select panels throughout the mural today, and I just want to note that the titles were not given to the panels by Orozco, so we have to, they're descriptive and I think relatively accurate, but we have to take them with a grain of salt when using them in our analysis. So Orozco described the idea animating the epic of American civilization as an American idea. This idea was embodied by the myth of Quetzalcoatl, which Orozco described as not only an autochthonous myth, but also a living one, quote, pointing clearly by its prophetic nature to the responsibility shared equally by the two Americas of creating here an authentic New World civilization, end quote. As this suggests, Orozco's America is not synonymous with the United States or Mexico, as some of his critics at the time would have it. Rather, the America to which he refers is hemispheric, encompassing all of North America and symbolically extending south to include Latin America as well. While Orozco's point of view clearly derives from his experiences as a Mexican, his fresco is not an expression of nationalist sentiment. Rather, he situates his New England audience in this oblique way to estrange U.S. Americans from their habitual, and in his mind, parochial understanding of American history. Instead of inaugurating his epic along the eastern seaboard of the contemporary United States with a settlement of devout Christians fleeing religious persecution, he begins it with migrations of indigenous peoples throughout North America and the subsequent development of great cultures with impressive achievements in agriculture, the arts, and science. In this way, he reminds his viewers that American civilization precedes European contact, while also casting colonization and the imposition of Christianity as violent and destructive, rather than the benevolent beginnings of a manifest destiny. This is a schematic map that shows you where the panels are located within the architectural space. Orozco uses the architectural division of the reserve reading room to divide his fresco into two related but separate epochs. The two halves of the cycle are separated physically by the reserve desk, which in turn marks the historical rupture between pre- and post-conquest America. So the desk is situated here, and the cycle breaks. Ancient America is on the west, modern civilization is on the right, and then this is the coda, which I'll be referring to at the end of the paper, which faces the reserve desk and lies outside of the cycle as such. The West Wing initiates the epic with scenes depicting an ancient golden age, inaugurated by the arrival of the Toltecan man-god Quetzalcoatl. The story continues along the East Wing with disturbing images of the modern world that follow from Hernan Cortes's military and spiritual conquest of this civilization. Orozco uses the myth of Quetzalcoatl to allegorize the trauma of conquest. While the figure of Quetzalcoatl is found throughout Mesoamerican civilizations, the exact origins of the myth are obscured by the fact that source information has invariably been filtered through Spanish colonial interlocutors. Nonetheless, the most popular and pervasive account describes Quetzalcoatl as a historical ruler of the lost city of Tolan, who was either named after a god or deified subsequently for his great leadership, and a god with manifold attributes. As a deity, Quetzalcoatl is associated with the wind as well as the morning star, but most significantly, he is a boundary crosser, a feathered serpent who combines attributes associated with both earth and sky. The man god, often referred to as Topaltzin Quetzalcoatl, is credited with banning human sacrifice and with the introduction of the cultivation of maize and the arts. His enlightened reign was corrupted by Tezcatlipoca, who drugged and humiliated him, resulting in banishment. Disgraced and rejected, Quetzalcoatl took leave of his people on a raft of serpents. The legend continues that upon his departure, he prophesied his return in the year 1 Reed, or as we know it, 1519, the date of Cortes's arrival at Veracruz, at which point he would avenge himself and destroy the civilization that had rejected him. González Mayo suggests that Orozco's version of the myth was influenced by two books he would have encountered in Dartmouth's library. The first is Samuel Goodrich's Lives of the Celebrated American Indians from 1849, in which Quetzalcoatl's reign is explicitly described as a golden age, and his achievements in the arts, religion, science, and politics are enumerated. The second source, John Hubert Cornyn's The Song of Quetzalcoatl, published in 1931, transcribes Nahuatl fragments from the Florentine Codex that pertain to the leader and the mythology surrounding his return. Mayo argues that Orozco depicts Quetzalcoatl as both an historical leader and a deified prophet. In the arrival panel, Quetzalcoatl appears in his guise as the fabled ruler of the Toltecs, emerging at the crossing of the pyramids of the sun and the moon and the ancient city of Teotihuacan. And here are the pyramids. In the departure panel, his beard has grown wild and he bears the aspect of a wizened prophet as he points dramatically toward the arrival of Spanish conquistadors who will destroy the society that rejected him. In this way, the sequence of panels dedicated to Quetzalcoatl's myth dramatizes the ruler's transformation from man to god, as well as his mythical return as the white bearded god, Cortes, In the shift from arrival to departure, Orozco employs the symbolic metaphor of daylight and dusk. Quetzalcoatl rises like the sun, illuminating Toltecan civilization, and then departs with the fall of night, thereby recalling his association with the morning star, while also characterizing his repudiation as the end of an enlightened epoch and the prefiguration of a dark age for American civilization. Orozco's version of the myth, then, is indebted to post-conquest Spanish sources that were widely accepted in his day, but which are now heavily debated. According to this story, the Spanish conquest was understood by its victims as the fulfillment of Quetzalcoatl's prophecy, and Cortes, because of his white pallor and beard, was perceived as Quetzalcoatl returned. Orozco uses this myth to establish a relationship between the ancient and modern world, essentially rewriting Enlightenment narratives of European encounter with the Americas from the standpoint of what he believed to be an indigenous worldview. Despite his praise for ancient indigenous civilization, Orozco draws a contrast between the accomplishments of Toltec and Mayan peoples, signified in the architectural references to the pyramids at Teotihuacan and Chichen Itza. So here we have Teotihuacan, and here the Castillo from Chichen Itza. So these are specific architectural monuments associated with these two specific cultures. Orozco makes a distinction between the Mayan and the Toltec and the Aztecs. This contrast is evident in two ways in the western half of Orozco's cycle. First, Orozco characterizes ancient human sacrifice as barbaric and outside of the enlightened reign of Quetzalcoatl. Second, he frames the interregnum of Quetzalcoatl's reign with equivalent but opposing scenes of Aztec warriors. The Spanish conquistadors Aztec warriors and Spanish conquistadors, thereby drawing a parallel between these two imperialistic and militaristic civilizations. They literally face off along the northern wall of the western corridor, with Quetzalcoatl's golden age positioned between them as if an enlightened parenthesis within a longer history of imperial aggression. By situating the scene of sacrifice prior to Quetzalcoatl's arrival within the sequence of panels, Orozco endorses the claim that ritual sacrifice was banned by the Toltecan leader. In this panel, Orozco associates human sacrifice with the Aztecs explicitly, despite the fact that several groups practiced human sacrifice and that historically the Aztecs post-date Quetzalcoatl's legendary reign. So as an image of Aztec brutality, this panel should logically follow the sequence dedicated to Quetzalcoatl. However, here, as in other instances, Orozco deliberately eschews a linear historical narrative in favor of a dialectical juxtaposition of ideas, barbaric sacrifice versus enlightenment. In both the ancient human sacrifice and Aztec warrior panels, Orozco makes reference to well-known statuary associated with the imperial practices of the Aztecs. The carved effigy of the feathered serpent located along the base of the Aztec warrior panel refers to those lining the ceremonial pyramid at Teotihuacan, in reference to the Aztecs' emulation of Toltecan urban design in their efforts to link their empire to Tolan and the enlightened legacy of Quetzalcoatl's reign. Two of the warriors are dressed as eagles and jaguars in reference to Quetzalcoatl's struggle with Tezcatlipoca, and the other two are rendered in the guise of Quetzalcoatl as the wind god. This is that depiction, based on illustrations in Cornyn's book. Thus, Orozco shows how Aztec veneration for Quetzalcoatl underpinned their military aggression. Orozco draws a visual distinction between Quetzalcoatl, the enlightened leader, and the petrified image of the feathered serpent that the Aztecs appropriated and deployed symbolically in warfare. This contrast is between oral tradition, the legend of Quetzalcoatl depicted along the north wall, and the construction of heritage through material cultural practices of appropriation. Through this contrast between a dynamic and living process on the one hand and the historicist petrification of the past into cultural treasures on the other, Orozco calls attention to the symbolic practice of tracing political origins to an idealized ancien regime. Orozco lends contemporary resonance to this critique in the scene of ancient human sacrifice as well. Here, a sacrifice takes place before a monolith whose attributes combine features associated with Huitzilopotli, the god of fire and war and the patron of the Aztec city of Tenochtitlan, and his ferocious mother, Coatlicue. And I'm showing you the Coatlicue monolith here and an illustration of one kind of illustration of Huitzilopotli that shows some of the attributes associated with him conventionally. And we can see in this monolith that there's a combination of the hearts and palms necklace that Coatlicue wears with the spear and shield and this little red decoration that often appears in images of Huitzilopochtli. So there's a sort of combined image of the two. Both deities are closely associated with the ritual precinct at Tenochtitlan, where one of the two sacrificial pyramids was dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, and perhaps more significantly, the infamous stone monolith depicting Coatlicue was found. Originally uncovered during the colonial period, the Coatlicue monolith was subsequently reburied, then briefly disinterred in the 18th century at the request of Baron Alexander von Humboldt, and finally placed in storage until the late 19th century when Mesoamerican antiquity and Aztec civilization in particular was reinvented by liberal elites as the origin of Mexico's mestizo heritage. This 19th century revivification of the Aztec past was enhanced and exacerbated in the post-revolutionary period by both politicians and intellectuals. It reached its apogee with the opening of the National Anthropology Museum in 1964, where the Coatlicue is today venerated within a soaring two-story gallery dedicated to a glorified Mexico Tenochtitlan. Orozco would have been very familiar with its predecessor institutions, wherein the monolith was exhibited in historic displays alongside the heroes of Mexican independence, creating what historian Luis Morales Moreno calls a museo patria, a patriotic museology, that functioned as propaganda for subsequent phases of Mexican statecraft. Orozco's reference to the Coatlicue monolith in particular suggests that this scene of ancient sacrifice does more than indict Aztec ritual practice. It also subtly calls attention to the role of heritage and the blood rituals of the modern state. This point is made explicit in the modern human sacrifice panel located across the corridor as a mirror image of the ancient scene. Here, the skeletal remains of an unknown soldier lies buried beneath laurels while a flame burns eternally in his honor. An aggressive war monument takes the place of the Huitzilopochtli Coatlicue monolith, while a fat cat politician stands in for a high priest, pronouncing on the heroic sacrifice of the nation's dead. Orozco develops, I'm glad somebody's laughing. Orozco's developed this panel after returning from a 3-month sojourn through Europe, taken after just after he'd begun the cycle, and he returned and completed it. While in France, he visited the tomb of the unknown soldier, which had only recently been installed between the L'Arc de Triomphe. This colossal monument anchors a sequence of triumphal arches that line the Champs-Élysées in Paris, a grand boulevard that comprises the city's historic axis. Modeled after Roman architecture, the arc exemplifies French neoclassicism, commemorating Revolutionary and Napoleonic wars. It symbolically associates modern France with imperial Rome. The eternal flame was added in 1920 to memorialize French soldiers who perished during World War I. Their anonymity stands in stark contrast with the meticulous recording of victories and generals named on the arch's inner and outer surface. By calling attention to the eternal flame in particular, Orozco indicts the depersonalization of death within modern warfare and the rationalization of slaughter through the glorifying rituals of national heritage. We need to keep these Aztec, Mexican, and French examples of historicist cultural appropriation in mind when assessing Orozco's representation of a pre-conquest golden age. For I argue that when evoking indigenous antiquity, Orozco is not endeavoring to repeat the strategies of the Aztecs toward the Toltecs, and even more so, he is not endorsing the politics of heritage employed by the modern state. Rather, Orozco's depiction of Quetzalcoatl's golden age serves to facilitate an anti-historicist critique of the contemporary politics of indigenismo that were being institutionalized by the ruling party in Mexico through the artistic collaboration of his peer, Diego Rivera. Mexican indigenismo was developed as part of the progressive social agenda of the Mexican mural Renaissance, spearheaded in 1921 by the post-revolutionary state. In order to restore a sense of civic unity after the 10-year Civil War, Minister of Education Jose Vasconcelos asked artists to paint edifying murals in the auditoriums and courtyards of federal buildings. The artists, many of whom had been radicalized by socialism, soon redirected Vasconcelos' mollifying agenda by executing mural cycles that emphasized not only the country's divisive class-based and ethnic antagonisms through scenes of conquest, revolution, and proletarian struggle, but also a sympathetic view of Mexico's vast indigenous and peasant underclass. And just as a point of reference, I'm showing you two of the most famous images from this period. Diego Rivera's, one of the panels from his Ministry of Public Education murals, where we see the venerated Tehuana, this indigenous woman, presiding over a table in which Mexico's various racialized and sort of classed citizenry is seated in sort of the new table of brotherhood. And over here, an example from Orozco from the National Preparatory Museum that shows Cortes and Malinche, his sort of concubine and translator, presented as the sort of primordial parents of modern mestizo Mexico. These are two examples of how indigenismo registered itself in visual art. Positing race as an ethnic force, the muralist eschewed the cultural superiority of European tradition from classical antiquity to the present and cultivated instead a modern art rooted in autochthonous American sources. A variant on modernist primitivism, indigenismo differs somewhat from the appropriation of non-Western cultural forms by European artists such as Pablo Picasso's interest in African sculpture, because it was motivated less by a desire to critique academic standards in art and more by a search for authentic identity. Mexican artists viewed indigenous culture not as an external other, but rather as an internal other that must be recuperated and brought into the cultural imaginary. The Mexican self, they insisted, must be conceived of through the colonial relationship between settlers and indigenous peoples and cultures. By the mid-1920s, government patronage had all but dried up, prompting artists to seek private commissions in regional centers throughout Mexico and in the United States. However, by the end of the decade, Mexican presidents had begun to appreciate the propagandistic value of the muralists' radical politics, and under the administration of Plutarco Elias Calles and his proxies, collectively known as the Maximato, the state awarded a high-profile commission to Diego Rivera to paint the history of Mexico in the grand staircase at the National Palace, the headquarters of the federal government, and in subsequent years, several mural artists were employed to decorate key federal institutions. This is the National Palace. Rivera's commission coincided with Calles' program to institutionalize the revolution through the creation of a ruling party, the National Revolutionary Party, or, as it's known, the PNR. Rivera's radical populism provided a progressive face for the conservative politics and political authoritarianism of the Maximato. Moreover, as Leonard Folgerate has shown, the national populism and discursive rendering of Mexico's history in Rivera's National Palace mural coincided neatly with Calles' rhetoric about the institutionalized revolution. Rivera's mural is divided into three scenes that correspond with the north, west, and south walls of the stairwell. This is the north wall, this is the west wall, this is the south wall. I'll show you details in a moment. The north wall depicts the Aztec world configured as the nation's past. The western wall provides a spatially and chronologically complex narrative of Mexican history from the point of conquest to revolution, and the south wall is dedicated to a Marxist vision of Mexico of today and tomorrow. The north wall, Rivera situates Aztec civilization as modern Mexico's point of origin. Like Orozco, Rivera recalls the Aztec veneration of Quetzalcoatl by depicting the man-god 4 times in an array of representations that reveal a clever integration of ethnographic research into his modernist figurative idiom. In the upper left corner, we see the plumed serpent emerging from a volcano. In the center, we see the historic man-god Topaltzin Quetzalcoatl, seated and ministering to his followers. On the top right, he appears again, departing on a serpent raft. And at the top, at the very top of the wall, Quetzalcoatl appears as the falling or setting sun, establishing a circular logic that connects up with the iconography of the south wall. Quetzalcoatl's reign is likewise idealized in Rivera's mural. However, as the viewer moves toward the larger western wall, depicting Mexico from the conquest to 1930, scenes of social unrest appear as an indigenous agitator attempts to organize tribute-paying subjects against the abuses of the Aztec Empire. So it's very idealized over here, but as you move toward the western wall, we see now images of tribute and exploitation with this sort of Aztec communist agitator here trying to rally his fellow men against the empire. On the western wall, the imagery is organized into 3 horizontal registers with scenes of Spanish conquest depicted along the bottom, episodes from the colonial period in the middle, and groupings of peasants and leaders associated with Mexico's post-independence history aligned across the top. The imagery is likewise organized into 5 vertical bands framed by the arches of the architectural space. These bands house clusters of historical figures associated with key military struggles in the nation's history. The French intervention and the U.S. invasion are represented in the outer arches, while the Revolution and Reform wars frame the central arch dedicated to Mexican independence. As Folgerate has argued, there is a general shift from illusionistic scenes of hand-to-hand combat along the lower register to a more static and spatially compressed depiction of history as discourse toward the top. As the viewer moves from the lower landing up the stairs to arrive at a balcony situated at a remove from the fresco, she is at first immersed in the near life-size battle scenes, but eventually steps back to enjoy a distanced view, her body now oriented toward the fresco in a similar manner as the many peasants depicted from behind in the act of witnessing or reading the numerous texts that accompany the figures in each arch. And I'm referring here to these figures that are dispersed throughout the mural, with their backs to the viewer, reading all these proclamations that are proffered by the leaders of Mexican political history. For this reason, Folgerate claims that the viewer's movement echoes the shift from action to institution, experience to discourse that the mural promotes. The historical and chronological complexity of the Western Wall is centered around an Aztec sculpture of an eagle with a war banner in its beak. This reference to an actual Aztec relief carving recalls the prophecy of an eagle with a serpent in its beak alighting upon a cactus that instructed the Mexica on where to found the imperial capital of Tenochtitlan. It also corresponds with the toponym of the modern Mexican flag, a motif that 19th century liberals appropriated from the Mexica to ground their new nation within indigenous antiquity. This symbol of empire and nation anchors the central vertical band, connecting the scene of the Aztec warrior Cuauhtémoc's heroic struggle against Cortes with the radical priest Miguel Hidalgo's uprising during the independence struggle and Emiliano Zapata's revolutionary factions agitating for land and reform. So we have Cuauhtémoc down here, Hidalgo here, Zapata here. Straight line. It thereby draws a straight line from the indigenous past to the modern state that asserts Aztec culture as a force of resistance, animating the nation's long struggle for independence and social justice against a host of colonizing and exploitative forces. The southern wall completes the cycle with a scene depicting Mexico of today and tomorrow, and as with its mirror image across the stairs, we see scenes of industry and exploitation, with a communist agitator attempting to organize the working classes. In the place of Quetzalcoatl, Rivera depicts Karl Marx holding a communist manifesto and pointing dramatically toward the east, where a utopian city rises as an emblem of the future, freed from class antagonism. So here's Marx. Here are the various agitators. Like Orozco's mural, Rivera's historical cycle is structured by Quetzalcoatl's myth. Only at the National Palace, it is the white-bearded Marx who represents the pagan god's prophetic return. The brilliant sun behind Marx represents Quetzalcoatl's symbolic return in the rising of the morning star. Marxism brings about the destruction of class exploitation shown depicted throughout the mural, and thus the utopian reinstatement of Quetzalcoatl's enlightened reign. Rivera's treatment of the prophecy corresponds with what Giorgio Agamben calls the oxymoronic structure of Messianism, in which an idealized past is married with a utopian vision of the future. The two incommensurate temporalities are joined in the figure of the Messiah, whose coming promises to literally take us back to the future. Rivera's Messianism likewise melds the class politics of Marxist theory with the racial politics of indigenismo in a way that nationalizes socialism by crafting it as the fulfillment of Quetzalcoatl's prophecy. He thereby partakes of the same historicism as the Calles regime, despite his Marxist political orientation. I think we need to view Orozco's mural as a critical response and reply to Rivera's National Palace mural, and it bears noting that this mural was incredibly controversial and extremely well publicized in its day. So Orozco was very aware of what Rivera was up to at the National Palace. I think we need to view returning to Orozco's arguments about idea versus historia, we can now see that it was Rivera's discursive approach to visual narration and the historicist symbolic structure of his cycle that Orozco was refuting. We can see this not only in Orozco's dialectical as opposed to linear approach to storytelling, but also in how he handles the prophetic structure of Messianism. 4, if we were to interpret Orozco's handling of the myth of Quetzalcoatl through the conventional structure that Rivera employs, we would have to view Christ, not Cortes, as his return. According to this logic, Orozco's mural would assert the indigenous past as an idealized point of reference for a future utopia, with Christ's resurrection configured as the Messianic event that completes the prophecy and brings about a return to Quetzalcoatl's golden age. Not only would a reading of this nature situate each section of the cycle in a chronological relationship, past, present, future, but also it would set up Orozco as a Christian militant, even zealot, akin to Rivera as vulgar Marxist. There are at least 3 arguments that mitigate against this interpretation. First, there is ample evidence, textual and visual, that Orozco was extremely opposed to the historicizing indigenismo Rivera deploys. Shortly before beginning the Dartmouth Commission, Orozco published a manifesto entitled New World, New Races, New Art, in which he pointedly criticized the artistic, quote, looting of indigenous remains of the New World with the object of copying its ruins or its folklore, end quote. Orozco calls for a new art, something that will express the unique spiritual and physical materiality of the New World. He suggests the Manhattan skyscraper as an exemplar of these new values and calls for a mural art that draws from its example. Orozco is clear throughout the manifesto that American artists should not look to an idealized past, whether European or indigenous, but rather cultivate an authentic expression forged in the unique properties of the now. Given the clarity of his conviction on this point, it is difficult to imagine that he would endorse an atavistic return to an indigenous antiquity in his fresco cycle. Second, Orozco's depiction of Christ destroying his cross begs questions about how to interpret the apocalyptic climax of his cycle. It is conventional to view this scene as an image of the resurrected Christ who returns to destroy rather than redeem humankind. Rather than accept his martyrdom signaled by the cross, Christ chops down the implement of his sacrifice, refusing to die for our sins, and instead bringing about kingdom come so that the Spirit might migrate to a new age. This interpretation is hard to sustain, however, because of the unorthodox liberties Orozco has taken with Christological iconography. Although bearing the marks of his crucifixion, Christ appears in the guise of the Pantocrator, or judge. His resurrected body, if indeed it is a resurrection scene, is not immaculate, thereby his humanity rather than his divinity is emphasized. The small panel entitled Chains of the Spirit, is here, that follows this image presents a scene of chains, locks, weapons, and keys presided over by vultures donning clerical collars. This iconography suggests that Orozco is actually referring to the anastasis, or harrowing of hell, an episode from the Passion conventionally associated with Easter. The anastasis takes place before the resurrection, during the 3 days and 3 nights that Christ's body remained dead in the tomb. Typically, Christ is shown releasing Adam from the chains of bondage, often using his cross to skewer Hades, while keys and locks are strewn about. In her exhaustive study, Ana Cartzones notes that the anastasis betrays temporal ambiguities in that it refers to resurrection, but it takes place during the death of Christ. In conventional anastasis scenes, this emphasizes the difference between Christ's human body and his embodiment as the Logos incarnate. In his panel, Orozco has layered references then to the Pantocrator with multiple episodes from the Passion, with an emphasis on what Cartzones calls the temporal ambiguities of the anastasis. Like early Christian illuminators, Orozco refrains from depicting the resurrection and thus the triumphal outcome that Christian eschatology predicts. Rather, the padlocks and vulturous clergy depicted in Chains of the Spirit suggest that the Spirit has not been released or migrated. Thus, this scene does not seem to bring the prophecy to a close. Rather, it leaves us arrested in time, still waiting for messianic redemption and the end of days. While Orozco's image partakes of the visual ambivalence about the resurrection and the temporal ambiguities of conventional anastasis iconography, it omits Adam's rising up from Hades. If Christ's rescue of Adam is meant to guarantee redemption, Orozco's image refrains from any such guarantee. Orozco's image of a vengeful Christ does not satisfy the longing for messianic redemption that it would seem to solicit. We need to read this refusal within the context of contemporary political theology, and in particular the messianic claims of Hitler in Germany, the Cristeros in Mexico, and even the secular presidential politics of the PNR, as well as Rivera's messianic characterization of Marx. Orozco seems to have understood, perhaps implicitly, the danger of the political embrace of messianism in the 1930s, and thus he evokes it only to undermine its promise that a Messiah will come to redeem our past, to make us whole. Orozco toyed with the idea of rendering an indigenous Christ in the final scene, and had he done so, it would be more compelling to interpret this final scene as Quetzalcoatl's return, much as Marx functions in Rivera's mural. However, he abandoned this idea, preferring instead to keep the relationship between the 3 messianic figures in the mural ambiguous and unresolved by prophecy. Finally, and this is my third argument against the historicist interpretation of the messianism in Orozco's mural, The physical and thematic structure of the cycle mitigates against this kind of historicist reading. Orozco's exploitation of the architectural features of the reserve corridor asserts a radical break between ancient and modern worlds. This cleaving of the present from the past is represented as well as a rupture with orality and myth. The past is available to us only through oral tradition as a myth. The present is characterized by a material history grounded in the trauma of conquest, an event that irreparably sundered modern America from the indigenous past. Thus, the two halves of the mural establish an asymmetry between past and present, the time of myth and the time of history, suggesting that these two approaches are being juxtaposed rather than placed on a continuum. We might read this juxtaposition as an attempt on Orozco's part to lift modern history into the realm of history, to glorify American nationalism within an autochthonous myth of indigenous prophecy. However, I am arguing that in Orozco's mural we are presented with two incommensurable temporalities, held side by side in a dialectical image. In the climactic scene, the time of history has come to a stop. This is not a transitional moment in a narrative of progress, it is an image of time standing still. The time of now, shot through, as Benjamin would say, with chips of Messianic time. Orozco's rendering of the American past is not intended to be an historically accurate depiction of Quetzalcoatl's reign. Rather, it represents a part of the constellation our era has formed with a definite earlier one. By evoking Quetzalcoatl's prophecy, Orozco conjures the historicist mode of indigenismo employed by both the authoritarian state and the Marxist left, but only to defy the conventional logic of Messianism that we see in Rivera's National Palace mural. Orozco's fresco does not, in fact, depict a Messiah that will take us back to the future. Rather, the arrest we experience in the final panel enacts what Benjamin calls a messianic cessation of happening that endows us with, quote, a revolutionary chance in the fight for an oppressed past, end quote. So if Orozco is not calling for a return to Quetzalcoatl's golden age, what then is the oppressed past that his dialectical image commands us to recognize? To hazard a response, I recall Orozco's comments about the living myth of Quetzalcoatl, in which he argues that the myth points, quote, clearly by its prophetic nature to the responsibility shared equally by the two Americas of creating here an authentic New World civilization, end quote. We should recall as well Orozco's manifesto, in which he argued that a new, authentically American culture follows from the physical and spiritual mestizaje, the new races of the New World. Keeping these two statements in mind, I want to review Orozco's depiction of Anglo and Hispano-America and suggest how his characterization of the two Americas informs the coda. For I argue Anglo and Hispano-America depict the mutual failure of the two Americas to heed Quetzalcoatl's prophecy. However, in the coda, Orozco hints at what an authentic New World civilization might be. Anglo and Hispano-America follow immediately scenes of conquest and modern industry. In these panels, their relative success and failure seems to flow from the technology-aided greed displayed by the conquistadors and its transmogrification into a dehumanized industrial modernity. Anglo-America, while politically stable, is stultifyingly conformist, peopled by a homogenized race of zombie-like white ethnics. Hispano-America is dynamic, but riddled with political corruption and caught up in cycles of bloodshed. Its populist revolutionaries stand up for an unrepresented underclass, but are routinely done in by a foreign and domestic elite. The variation of skin tone in this panel reflects the intersection of race and class that perpetuates Latin American social inequality. Both Americas suffer from the racial antagonisms that European exploration and colonization set in motion. In its relentless promotion of a singular WASP identity, Anglo-America excludes all difference from its national imaginary. Hispano-America, on the other hand, exploits racial difference to maintain and exacerbate class hierarchy. In these panels, Orozco foregrounds race and racism as key features of American nationalism and state formation. He shows that national imaginaries predicated on an empty promotion of racial hybridity are as socially destructive as those structured by its disavowal. Neither America has grappled effectively with the ethical dilemmas of the post-colonial settler state, and thus both, and implicitly all nationalisms, fall prey to the blood ritual of industrialized warfare depicted in modern human sacrifice. In the coda, Orozco depicts yet another temporality, one in which the industrial achievements of the modern epoch continue, but without sacrificing human life, labor, and leisure to the almighty machine. Orozco symbolizes this new age through modern steel frame architecture and the image of a racially hybrid man depicted in worker's garb, but shown in repose, reading a book. This mestizo man stands in for the promise of a racially equitable America wherein the values established by Quetzalcoatl's enlightened reign might once again be possible. Orozco visually evokes this analogy by likening the body and posture of the modern industrial man to that of the sleeping figure lying beneath Quetzalcoatl in the arrival panel. A low brick wall indicates the building of a new civilization in the ancient scene, just as a steel-framed skyscraper signifies the new man under construction in the fresco's coda. In this way, Orozco argues modern and ancient humanity are connected genealogically and spiritually, despite the radical change our social environment has undergone. Orozco is careful, however, not to indulge in easy utopianism. The alternate temporality suggested in his coda is left deliberately vague and stripped of anachronism. Orozco points to the possibility of a new age imbued with the ethical values of Quetzalcoatl's reign without implying that it will constitute a return to a prelapsarian past. Preparatory drawings reveal that Orozco modeled his reading figure after a Dartmouth undergraduate. In the sketch, we see a square-jawed collegiate male with a crew cut wearing a sport coat. In every way, this figure corresponds with the conventional image of the Dartmouth man, an athletic, studious, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. However, as he developed the image, Orozco turned his Dartmouth wasp into a racially ambiguous worker. It is important to recall that Dartmouth is a private college, and a raced worker like the one Orozco depicts would have had a hard time gaining access to the library's resources in the 1930s, a fact that Orozco must have noted. So what are we to make of this coda to the artist's indictment of the modern history of the Americas? Some are tempted to see this as an endorsement of communist politics, whereby the worker becomes the subject of history. Others see this figure as a mestizo and read the final panel as a reference to the Mexican school's endorsement of a future-oriented cosmic race. And still others see this man as an African-American and read his presence as an overt critique of the racial politics of 1930s United States. Following Benjamin, I argue that this is indeed a mestizo figure, whose racial identification is left deliberately ambiguous. What matters is that he represents the new races that Orozco exalted in his manifesto. He does not represent the worker as the subject of history, as my Marxist colleagues would have it, but rather he is a configuration of the weak Messianic power that we possess. To conclude then, I offer a reading from one of my Dartmouth students, Nicola Tucker, who was given the task of writing about Orozco's mural and the epic form in my senior seminar on Mexican muralism. In her essay, Tucker argued that it is the viewer who plays the part of the epic hero in Orozco's cycle. Treating the fresco as a performative rite through which the viewer undergoes a radical re-education in American history and emerges transformed, she suggests that the mestizo worker, quote, embodies the new state the Dartmouth student initiate enters after performing the cycle, end quote. In this new state, the hero of America's epic is transformed from the hegemonic privileged white subject into a working class mestizo. He is no longer the progeny of a European genealogy, but rather the hybrid offspring of the violent encounters between Europeans and their colonized or enslaved others. And here it is significant that Orozco's figure could just as easily be read as African-American as mestizo. For Orozco, there is no savior, no Messiah who will make whole what Cortes sundered. Our salvation does not rest with an atavistic return to a pre-Cortesian reality, nor will it come from an historicist construction of an indigenized nation state. It will come if, and only if, we recognize the race problem as our own. And here I reiterate that it is significant that Orozco executed this cycle in and for a U.S. American audience. By transposing the body of the white Dartmouth undergrad with the body of a raced worker, Orozco visualizes what our redemption would look like. Redemption will come when we can see ourselves through the living prophecy of Quetzalcoatl, when we can cease thinking of Anglo-America as having nothing to do with Hispano-America, and when both Americas grapple with the psychic consequences of living in a post-colonial settler state. When we can see the mestizo worker reading in the coda not as a symbol for a period politics of race and class, but as a true reflection of ourselves. We are only now beginning to recognize the image of the past that Orozco has seized as a concern of our own. We are only now beginning to exercise the weak Messianic power to which this past has a claim. In characterizing the revolutionary hope of Benjamin's notion of Messianic power, Walter Hamaker writes that, quote, each possibility that was missed in the past remains a possibility for the future, precisely because it has not found fulfillment. For the past to have a future merely means that the past possibilities have not yet found fulfillment, that they continue to have an effect as intentions and demand their realization from those who feel addressed by them, end quote. I would like to end with this quote to demonstrate the hope that I see in the Messianic structure of Orozco's Epic of American Civilization. The fact that we are all here commemorating his achievement at Dartmouth some 80 years hence suggests that there is still a future for Quetzalcoatl's golden age in our America. That's the end. I'm happy to, I know it's a long talk, but I'm happy to entertain questions. Hey, Richard, yeah.
And I want to ask a question about the fact that you ended on a hope.
Yeah.
Benjamin wrote the thesis right before he committed suicide.
Yeah.
In 1940. And it's often referred to as a theory of melancholy history. Mm-hmm. Also, his Messiah is not going to be Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. He's a Jew, a second Jew. So the Messiah has not come through him. Right. The idea of Messianic time has not yet been defined. So I wonder if, and you do make it clear that the appearance of Christ in the mural is not the appearance of a fulfilled history, which Benjamin would agree with. But I wonder if your emphasis on hope is too hopeful, and it doesn't take into consideration, the depression, the depressive view of history that Benjamin had.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, in the end, I don't think as misanthropic and dark as Orozco was, I don't think he was as hopeless as Benjamin, and that is a function of his privilege. I mean, he wasn't a Jew in Hitler's Germany. He was a relatively privileged Creole, mestizo in Mexico. I ended on hope because I do think there is hope in the mural, and I wanted to kind of push against this sort of the criticism that it often receives as that it's just this slash and burn, criticizing everything, from Christianity to Dartmouth to Anglo-America. Because I do think, and this is sort of picking up on Benjamin's, those moments in the theses where he talks about hope, where he talks about the possibility of restoring the fullness of the past, so that any moment from the past could possibly be could have resonance and be recognized by us as a concern of our own, which would sort of potentially undo the kind of violent reduction of historicism that seeks to constantly identify our present with this sort of history of military victories, essentially. So I think there is a little hope in there, although I think for Benjamin it's a kind of desperate hope. And for Orozco, I think he's also quite skeptical about any utopia, any future, any ideology, anyone who claims to have the answer for anything. But I think that he is focusing on the oppressed, that is, telling the history of the Americas from the standpoint of the oppressed for precisely the same reason, to sort of move us away from a kind of victorious, teleological, progressive notion of enlightened nation building toward one that has a more just social and sort of racial, has an ethics, at least, of sort of social justice. And that last panel, it's unusual for him. He really refrains from doing this again, and by sort of depicting something that could be interpreted as a utopian, even Marxist image, in favor of just these men of fire. That's kind of the most utopian he gets after this. And that coda really stymies scholars a lot who either want to read it as just a full-on endorsement of Marxism, which I just do not believe it is, or as some kind of uncritical embrace of a Vasconcelian notion of a cosmic race, another prophetic kind of account of America. And I do think in the sort of explicit racializing of that figure that he is sort of suggesting that race is the hinge that we have to work with. We have to see ourselves as called by ancient indigenous mythology instead of seeing ourselves as somehow totally separate from that. I don't know if that totally gets at your question, but yeah, Ida.
I wanted to ask you about your view about the statue of the broken statue of the Buddha that was behind Christ. And I don't know, the other thing is that a broken column, a Greek column?
Yeah. So Orozco does this a lot. I mean, the Buddha is a little strange. I think it's there because he is trying to sort of indict all of civilization, not just Christian civilization. So he kind of throws it in there as a icon of something outside of the Western tradition, I think. I mean, it's an open question. The column is a motif he uses over and over and over again. It always, as an architectural marker, it always signifies Western civilization. He often uses it to depict the imposition of European culture in the Americas. And I'm glad you asked, because I did bring these images of 2 other iterations of Christ destroying his cross that Orozco painted, one very early in his career in the destroyed cycle at the National Preparatory. This was actually titled The Redeemer. He ultimately destroyed this image and repainted much more kind of contemporary images in its stead. And the other is a very late work, an oil, also of Christ destroying his cross, where you can see these symbols of culture strewn about books and columns, and the cross, of course, and then the fire, the flames of purification, which show up again and again. And there are lots of ways to interpret this. One is as sort of Christ's, this apocalypse. Another related one is in Mexico in the 1930s, there's a whole lot of propaganda circulating for and against the Cristero War, this war fought in the name of Christ, a sort of coup fought in the name of Christ against the post-revolutionary regime, in which images of Christ are sort of deployed both as an emblem of the prophecy of sort of Christian rectitude, and also as on the other side, by the leftists, as an image of sort of hypocrisy, etc. And the sort of final, so Orozco seems to be responding to that iconography a lot in these murals. And the final thing is, Renato Gonzalez Mayo argues that for Orozco this is really a sort of symbol of the destruction of old orders of language, bringing about a new language. And this to me feels very Benjaminian, and sort of very much in his sort of understanding of post-Messianic time where literally words mean the words start to mean their real meaning, and everything before that is this confusion. And so Gonzalez Mayo thinks that's what this image means. For me, it's always an open question, because his representations of Christ are so unorthodox that they're very slippery, and I don't feel like I can say for sure, but I have this hunch that I keep pursuing. I don't know, does that help? Okay, thanks.
It's really great. And there's a reception in the Kim Gallery upstairs, but thank you, Mary, for a wonderful lecture.
Thank you.